Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 20 going with today's Third Age Thursday, a time for us to revisit the familiar and sometimes not so familiar stories of the Third Age. Now, today we're going back again to Appendix A3. Now, by now I thought we'd be wrapping up our readings about Durin's folk, but there's actually too much left, so we'll finish next week. Last time, we read about how the dwarves couldn't be turned into wraiths or otherwise dominated by Sauron via the Dwarven rings, and how Sauron hated them for this and wanted the rings back. And we'll pick up there. It was therefore perhaps partly by the malice of the ring that Thrain, after some years, became restless and discontented. The lust for gold was ever in his mind. At last, when he could endure it no longer, he turned his thoughts to Erebor and resolved to go back there. He said nothing to Thorin of what was in his heart, but with Balin and Dwalin and a few others, he arose and said farewell and departed. Little is known of what happened to him afterwards. It would now seem that as soon as he was abroad with few companions, he was hunted by the emissaries of Sauron. Wolves pursued him, orcs waylaid him, evil birds shadowed his path, and the more he strove to go north, the more misfortunes opposed him. There came a dark night when he and his companions were wandering in the land beyond Anduin, and they were driven by a black rain to take shelter under the eaves of Mirkwood. In the morning, he was gone from the camp, and his companions called him in vain. They searched for him many days, until at last, giving up hope, they departed and came at length back to Thorin. Only long after was it learned that Thrain had been taken alive and brought to the pits of Dol Guldur. There he was tormented, and the ring taken from him, and there at last he died. So Thorin Oakenshield became the heir of Durin, but an heir without hope. When Thrain was lost, he was 95, a great dwarf of proud bearing, but he seemed content to remain in Eriador. There he labored long, and trafficked, and gained such wealth as he could, and his people were increased by many of the wandering folk of Durin who heard of his dwelling in the west and came to him. Now they had fair halls in the mountains and store of goods, and their days did not seem so hard, though in their songs they spoke ever of the lonely mountain far away. The years lengthened. The embers in the heart of Thorin grew hot again as he brooded on the wrongs of his house and the vengeance upon the dragon that he had inherited. He thought of weapons and armies and alliances as his great hammer rang in his forge, but the armies were dispersed, and the alliances broken, and the axes of his people were few, and a great anger without hope burned him as he smote the red iron on the anvil. But at last there came about by chance a meeting between Gandalf and Thorin that changed all the fortunes of the house of Durin, and led to other and greater ends beside. On a time, Thorin, returning west from a journey, stayed at Bree for the night. There Gandalf was also. He was on his way to the Shire, which he had not visited for some 20 years. He was weary, and thought to rest there for a while. Among many cares, he was troubled in mind by the perilous state of the north, because he knew then already that Sauron was plotting war, and intended, as soon as he felt strong enough, to attack Rivendell. But to resist any attempt from the east to regain the lands of Angmar and the northern passes in the mountains, there were now only the dwarves of the Iron Hills, and beyond them lay the desolation of the dragon. The dragon Sauron might use with terrible effect. How, then, could the end of Smaug be achieved? It was even as Gandalf sat and pondered this that Thorin stood before him and said, "Master Gandalf, I know you only by sight, but now I shall be glad to speak with you, for you have often come into my thoughts of late, as if I were bidden to seek you. Indeed, I should have done so, if I had known where to find you." Gandalf looked at him with wonder. "That is strange, Thorin Oakenshield," he said, "for I have thought of you also, and though I am on my way to the Shire, it was in my mind that is the way also to your halls." "Call them so if you will," said Thorin. "They are only poor lodgings in exile, but you would be welcome there if you would come, for they say that you are wise, and know more than any other of what goes on in the world, and I have much on my mind, and will be glad of your counsel." "I will come," said Gandalf, "for I guess that we share one trouble at least. The dragon of Erebor is on my mind, and I do not think that he will be forgotten by the grandson of Thror. Yes, with the loss of his father Thrain, Thorin has become the king of his people. But his father is gone, and though he was a successful leader, overseeing his people's successes and watching their wealth grow, he would not be content for long. The embers of his heart grew hot again. What a phrase. And then we get that chance meeting, but I just need to remind you right here that things like this are simply not chance, and we'll talk more about that next week. For now, though, that wraps it up for this week's Third Age Thursday. Come back next week as we finally do finish the appendices on Durin's folk as we reach my favorite Legolas and Gimli moment. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout with me, a bonus weekly episode, and a whole lot more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times as I welcome another special guest for Fandom Friday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.